Steam rose from Alexander Hayes' coffee cup as he navigated the deserted downtown streets at 317 AC. The city slept beneath a blanket of October drizzle, streetlights painting amber pools on wet asphalt. His Tesla whispered to a stop outside the office tower. Then the world tilted. There, pressed against the glass entrance like a broken bird, sat Zoe Campbell. Rain traced silver lines down her pale cheeks as she clutched a waterlogged notebook to her chest. The intern who'd impressed every executive with her quiet brilliance, who stayed until the janitors went home, perfecting presentations in the glow of her computer screen. Now her canvas sneakers leaked puddles onto marble steps, her company blazer dark with moisture. Alexander's hands went numb around his steering wheel. What he did next would shock Wall Street, make international headlines, and prove that sometimes the most dangerous thing a CEO can do is care. The memory struck Alexander like lightning as he stared at Zoe's crumpled form pressed against corporate glass. 3 years ago, different hospital, same helplessness weighing down on his chest like concrete blocks crushing his soul. Jessica's hand growing cold while machines announced their electronic failure in steady, merciless beeps echoing through sterile corridors. The doctors speaking in euphemisms about complications and timing, as if gentle language could somehow soften the devastation. He'd commanded boardrooms and built empires from nothing but determination, but couldn't save the one person who mattered most. His father's company badge sat forgotten in his desk drawer, brass tarnished with age and years of neglect. Emma Rose had been asking uncomfortable questions lately that pierced through his carefully constructed emotional walls like arrows. Why Daddy worked past bedtime every night, missing dinner and bedtime stories completely and utterly without explanation or apology. Why Mommy's picture stayed face down on the nightstand, like a shameful secret that needed to be buried forever. Why he flinched whenever ambulance sirens wailed through their quiet suburban neighborhood at night, triggering memories he couldn't suppress. At 7, she possessed her mother's intuition for emotional undercurrents adults tried desperately to hide from the world. Last week she'd drawn a picture of their family with an empty space labeled "New Mommy" in purple crayon. His phone buzzed with board member Richard Morrison's name glowing accusingly against the dashboard display like a digital summons. The call went to voicemail, but the message was predictable corporate scripture about cost reduction and operational efficiency measures. Euphemisms for destroying human lives to satisfy shareholders who measured human worth in decimal points and quarterly projections only. Alexander's jaw clenched as Zoe shifted against the glass doors, her notebook slipping slowly from fingers too numb to grip. The same hands that crafted presentations impressive enough to win million-dollar contracts from Fortune 500 companies worldwide. Her dedication was legendary among staff members, yet here she sat on cold marble like discarded refuse. The Tesla's leather interior felt suffocating as rain drummed against bulletproof glass like accusations from heaven above demanding justice. His coffee had gone bitter, reflecting his own taste for moral compromises that sacrificed principle for profit margins and shareholder satisfaction. Tomorrow's board meeting loomed with demands for workforce reduction, human resources transformed into line items on spreadsheets and PowerPoint presentations. But spreadsheets couldn't capture the exhaustion etched into Zoe's face when she thought nobody was watching her struggle. Numbers couldn't quantify the dignity she maintained while drowning in circumstances completely beyond her control or understanding. The disconnect between corporate metrics and human reality felt obscene in this moment of clarity. Alexander stepped into October's bitter bite, rain immediately soaking through his $1,000 wool coat like ice water penetrating to his bones. Italian leather shoes clicked against wet marble as he approached the entrance. Where corporate success met human failure head-on. Zoe's head snapped up, dark eyes wide with terror that mixed shame and desperate hope for rescue from this nightmare. She scrambled upright, notebook pressed against her chest like fragile armor against the world's endless cruelty and indifference. Water dripped from her hair onto steps that reflected streetlight like broken mirrors of lost possibility and shattered dreams. Her lips moved silently, forming apologies for existing in spaces where poverty wasn't permitted by corporate aesthetics and image. "Mr. Hayes," Zoe whispered, voice barely audible above rain's percussion against glass and concrete surfaces throughout the empty district. She pressed herself against the doors, as if trying to disappear into their reflection, completely and utterly without trace. Canvas shoes squeaked against wet marble as she shifted weight nervously from foot to foot, like a child caught stealing. "I was just waiting for the rain to stop. I wasn't trying to—" Words died in her throat, replaced by chattering teeth and shallow breaths that spoke of bone-deep exhaustion. Alexander noticed how her hands trembled from more than cold, carrying the particular shake of someone whose world had narrowed to survival. Her company badge hung crooked, a symbol of belonging that felt increasingly hollow and meaningless in this moment. "Get in the car." Alexander's voice cut through rain with quiet authority that brooked no argument or explanation from anyone present. He turned without waiting for response, knowing hesitation would amplify her humiliation beyond what any human being should bear. Behind him, he heard Zoe's sharp intake of breath, fabric rustling as she gathered possessions that fit in a single notebook. Her footsteps hesitated on marble, then quickened as October rain began falling harder against everything in sight. The Tesla's doors closed with whispered finality, sealing them into leather-scented silence and unspoken understanding of what this moment meant. The dashboard clock read 3:21 a.m., marking this moment in digital precision for posterity and memory. Downtown Marriott sat 7 minutes away through empty streets that glistened like black silk under sodium lights casting eerie shadows. Neither spoke, but Alexander felt Zoe's tension radiating like heat from a barely contained furnace ready to explode. She kept her notebook pressed against her chest, leaving damp impressions on leather that cost more than her salary. Her reflection in the passenger window looked ghostly, haunted by circumstances that should never touch someone so young and dedicated. At red lights, Alexander caught glimpses of her profile. Determined jawline despite everything, rapid blinking to clear water from lashes. The city's night architecture passed by like a movie set, all surface and no substance or meaning. Traffic lights marked time in red, yellow, green cycles of urban rhythm and mechanical precision. Hotel lobby warmth enveloped them like expensive perfume, crystal chandeliers casting soft light on Italian marble that whispered wealth and discretion. Night clerk barely glanced up as Alexander approached the granite desk, platinum credit card positioned for transaction without question or hesitation. "1 room, 2 nights," he said quietly, sliding plastic across polished stone with practiced efficiency born from years of business travel. Zoe stood behind him, dripping onto floor that janitors would mop within minutes, her presence simultaneously invisible and glaringly obvious. Late-night travelers nursed cocktails in the adjacent bar where soft jazz played over murmured conversations about money and power. The contrast between luxury and desperation felt sharp enough to cut glass and draw blood from anyone watching. "I can't accept this." Zoe's voice cracked like thin ice under pressure as they stood before elevator doors waiting for arrival. Her knuckles went white around the keycard Alexander had pressed into her palm with gentle but firm insistence. "This isn't charity I need." Elevator arrived with soft chime, doors sliding open to reveal their reflection in polished steel interior, like a mirror. Two people from different worlds, brought together by rain and circumstance and desperation that made pride a luxury nobody could afford. Alexander stepped inside first, waited patiently for her decision. After a heartbeat that felt like eternity, Zoe followed reluctantly into the ascending chamber. The elevator's ascent felt like rising from one reality into another entirely different dimension of possibility. "This isn't charity," Alexander said, as numbers climbed steadily toward the 15th floor with mechanical precision and inevitability. "This is basic human decency." 8, 9, 10 floors passed in measured increments of time and space, carefully counted and observed. Zoe's breathing had steadied, but her hands still shook with residual shock and overwhelming gratitude she couldn't yet process. She stared at their reflection in elevator doors, seeing herself as Alexander saw her, young, brilliant, broken by forces. The elevator stopped with barely a whisper, opening onto a hallway where thick carpet muffled their footsteps completely. Hotel artwork depicted abstract shapes that meant nothing and everything simultaneously, depending on perspective and interpretation of the observer. The hallway stretched ahead like a corridor between past and future, decision and consequence. Alexander left Zoe at her door with instructions to order room service and charge everything to the account without limitation or concern. Her thank you was barely audible, spoken to carpet rather than his face, carrying weight that simple words couldn't bear. The door closed with soft click, leaving him alone in the hallway with the enormity of what he'd witnessed tonight. His phone buzzed with another Morrison message. "Emergency board meeting moved to 8 a.m. Personnel reductions approved for immediate implementation tomorrow." Alexander deleted the message without reading it twice, some decisions requiring more than spreadsheets and shareholder obligations to justify their cost. The hotel's silence felt heavy with unspoken promises and uncertain futures stretching ahead into unknown territory. He walked away knowing everything had changed in ways he couldn't yet comprehend or fully understand. The drive home took Alexander through neighborhoods that transitioned from corporate glass towers to tree-lined suburbs where his world existed. His house sat at cul-de-sac's end, Tudor brick with windows glowing yellow against October night like beacon of warmth. Inside, Emma Rose slept peacefully in her canopy bed, surrounded by stuffed animals and innocent childhood dreams. Mrs. Chen dozed in the living room recliner, television flickering with late-night advertisements, selling happiness through monthly payments. The contrast between his world and Zoe's felt like a chasm that money had created and maintained systematically. He paid Mrs. Chen and watched her Honda disappear into suburban darkness before checking on Emma one final time. The house felt too large, too empty, too insulated from the reality he'd witnessed tonight on corporate marble steps. She'd kicked off covers again, dark hair spread across her pillow like spilled ink against white cotton sheets freshly laundered. He pulled the blanket to her chin carefully, avoiding the creaking floorboard that would wake her from peaceful sleep. On her nightstand sat a crayon drawing, stick figures holding hands under bright yellow sun shining down on them. "Daddy and me and new mummy," written in purple letters at the bottom margin, clearly and hopefully. Alexander's throat tightened as he turned off the light and closed the door quietly behind him with infinite care. The house felt haunted by Jessica's absence, and his own moral failures accumulated over years of compromise. Every comfort felt like an accusation against his conscience and the choices he'd made for profit. His study welcomed him with familiar scents of leather and aged whiskey. 18-year-old Macallan, waiting in crystal decanter like liquid amber. Rain continued against windows that framed the city like a three-dimensional photograph of human ambition and suffering. The company badge from his father's old uniform sat on mahogany desk, brass worn smooth by decades of handling. "People first," engraved in letters that felt like accusation, now against everything he'd become in pursuit of success. When Hayes Industries employed 12 people with dreams bigger than their bank accounts, that motto meant something real and tangible. Now Hayes Technologies employed 800 across 3 states, But people had become quarterly statistics and cost-benefit analyses. The transformation from family business to corporate machine felt complete and utterly soulless in this moment of reflection. Scotch burned his throat as memories surfaced unbidden from depths where he'd buried them under corporate success and achievement. His father working double shifts during the 1991 recession to keep employees on payroll without any layoffs. Thanksgiving dinners where half the guests were company families struggling through temporary hardships and economic uncertainty together. The way his father's hand shook with Parkinson's during final years, but his voice never wavered when discussing welfare. "Son," he'd whispered from his hospital bed, "money's just paper. People matter." The badge felt heavier in Alexander's palm than physics could explain through simple molecular density and weight. It carried the burden of abandoned principles and forgotten promises made to his father's memory and legacy. Sleep came in fragments interrupted by dreams of rain-soaked faces and board meetings where numbers danced like demons around tables. Alexander woke at 5:30 to Emma Rose singing in the kitchen, her voice bright with morning energy. She stood on her step stool at granite counter, attempting pancakes from box mix, flour dusting her pajamas. "Daddy!" she exclaimed, chocolate chips scattered across counter like tiny promises of sweetness and joy. "I'm making breakfast for the sad lady you helped." Children saw through adult pretense with devastating clarity that exposed truth. Her innocence felt like a mirror reflecting his own moral bankruptcy back at him with unforgiving precision. The morning light streaming through windows made everything seem possible, even redemption for past failures and compromises. "What sad lady, sweetheart?" Alexander asked, though his heart already knew the answer that would complicate everything further than imaginable. He moved behind Emma Rose, steadying her elbow as she wielded the whisk with more enthusiasm than actual technique. Pancake batter looked like abstract art, lumpy enough to stand a spoon in without falling over or collapsing. But Emma Rose's smile could power the house for weeks, and Alexander found himself smirking despite everything awaiting him. Outside, October sunshine painted kitchen walls gold, transforming night's crisis into something manageable and hopeful for the future. The golden light made the kitchen feel like sanctuary from the corporate world that waited outside their door. "The one sleeping in the rain," Emma Rose said matter-of-factly, adding another handful of chocolate chips with 7-year-old logic and reasoning. "Mrs. Chen told me you helped someone lonely, and I dreamed about her." Alexander's breath caught at his daughter's intuitive understanding. Emma Rose possessed her mother's gift for sensing emotional undercurrents others missed completely in their busy lives. Pancake batter bubbled as she stirred, creating tiny volcanoes that erupted with each circular motion of the spoon. "Lonely people need pancakes, Daddy. Can we invite her for breakfast sometime?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to his conscience and everything he thought he understood about appropriate boundaries. Her suggestion felt like wisdom beyond her years, simple truth that adults had forgotten in their complexity. The office buzzed with pre-meeting tension when Alexander arrived, senior staff clustering in small groups with voices low enough to suggest conspiracy. The elevator felt like a tomb, carrying him toward the executive floor, each number passing with mechanical precision. Rebecca had arranged his morning schedule with military efficiency: coffee with CFO at 7:30, board meeting at 8 sharp. No time allocated for humanity, he noticed with bitter irony that tasted like ashes in his mouth. The corporate machine ground forward relentlessly, crushing human considerations under the weight of quarterly demands and shareholder expectations. He wondered how many other Zoes existed within their company, struggling silently while executives counted profits and planned for expansion. The building itself felt like a monument to systematic indifference, disguised as professional efficiency and modern business practices. CFO Jonathan Pierce looked like he'd slept in his office again, tie hanging loose around his neck like noose. Coffee stains mapped his shirt like battle scars from corporate warfare fought with spreadsheets and statistical projections. "The numbers don't lie, Alex," he said, sliding tablet across conference table with the enthusiasm of Undertaker. "We're hemorrhaging $200,000 monthly on what the board calls excessive labor costs. Translation, we treat people too well." The tablet screen showed graphs that reduced human lives to red ink and downward trending arrows. Each downward trending arrow represented families, dreams, and futures that board members would destroy without hesitation or remorse. The clinical nature of their discussion felt like planning a genocide using PowerPoint slides and quarterly projections. Alexander studied the spreadsheet with growing revulsion at what they'd become under pressure from shareholders who viewed employee welfare as theft. Entry-level positions highlighted in red for potential elimination, like targets in a shooting gallery awaiting execution. Benefits packages marked as overly generous compared to industry standards that measured human worth in cost-per-unit calculations. Healthcare contributions deemed unsustainable in markets where suffering was acceptable overhead for quarterly growth and profit maximization. His father's voice echoed from memory. "The moment you stop seeing employees as people is the moment you stop being human." The tablet felt cold in his hands, its screen reflecting his own moral bankruptcy and complicity. The numbers told a story of systematic dehumanization disguised as business necessity and market forces beyond anyone's control. The boardroom filled with familiar faces of Hayes Technologies' power structure, 12 board members arranged around expensive furniture that cost more than salaries. Richard Morrison sat at the far end, silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour and late-night plotting. Margaret Winters adjusted reading glasses with surgical precision, every movement calculated for maximum intimidation and psychological control. These were people who could reduce human suffering to acceptable percentages, who spoke of trimming fat when they meant families. Alexander took his seat feeling like he was attending his own moral execution, while maintaining professional composure. The room's expensive artwork and furnishings felt like decorations in a mausoleum where conscience came to die slowly. The conference table gleamed under LED lighting like altar for sacrifice of human dignity to corporate gods. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison began, voice carrying authority of old money and older prejudices against anything resembling human compassion or weakness. "We're here to discuss operational efficiency." The euphemism hung in recycled air like toxic gas designed to make murder sound reasonable. Slides appeared on wall screen. Productivity metrics, cost-benefit analyses, projections that painted human employment as increasingly obsolete business model. Each chart told the same story. Profits and people existed in inverse relationship that could only be resolved through elimination. The presentation felt like watching a slow-motion execution of everything his father had built, from nothing but determination. Corporate efficiency had become a religion that demanded human sacrifice on the altar of shareholder value and quarterly growth. Morrison clicked to the next slide, with theatrical timing that suggested practice and rehearsal. Recommended personnel reductions. 27 names appeared in corporate red, including 5 marketing interns, whose crime was existing in entry-level positions. Zoe Campbell's name sat third from the top, highlighted like a target for executive assassination and elimination. Alexander's coffee cup rattled against saucer as his hand trembled with suppressed rage and complete disbelief. Around the table, board members nodded with practiced indifference, born from years of treating humans like inventory to be discounted. The casual way they discussed destroying lives felt like watching sociopaths plan a massacre with PowerPoint presentations. The red highlighting felt like blood splattered across a death warrant signed by corporate indifference and shareholder greed. "Marketing shows particular redundancy," Morrison continued, laser pointer dancing across Zoe's name like a sniper's sight-seeking kill shot. Multiple interns performing similar functions with minimal output differential. We can eliminate 4 positions while maintaining productivity through workload redistribution. Alexander watched the red dot hover over Zoe's entry while calculating her annual salary. $28,000. Her benefits package, basic healthcare, and 2 weeks vacation time. Her crime, working too hard for too little while caring for dying mother with stage 3 cancer. The mathematics of human disposal felt obscene when reduced to PowerPoint presentations and laser pointers dancing across names. The clinical language couldn't disguise the fact that they were planning to destroy lives for quarterly convenience. Alexander's phone buzzed with text from Emma Rose, sent through Mrs. Chen's device. "Daddy, I made extra pancakes for your sad friend." The message included a photo of chocolate chip pancakes arranged in smiley face pattern, surrounded by Emma Rose's artwork depicting figures. The contrast between childhood innocence and corporate brutality hit Alexander like physical violence against his conscience and soul. His 7-year-old daughter understood compassion better than adults with decades of business experience who discussed destroying lives. The image of those pancakes burned in his mind like a beacon of hope in a boardroom filled with darkness. The innocent joy in Emma's creation felt like rebuke to everything they were discussing in this sterile room. "Mr. Hayes," Morrison's voice cut through Alexander's thoughts like a scalpel seeking nerve endings to sever completely and permanently. "Your input on the marketing reductions?" 11 pairs of eyes focused on him with predatory intensity, waiting for acquiescence to calculated cruelty. The boardroom walls seemed to press inward, expensive artwork mocking the human cost of their quarterly obsessions and profit demands. Alexander's father's badge felt heavy in his jacket pocket, brass warming against his chest like heartbeat of conscience. The moment stretched like wire under tension, ready to snap under the weight of moral choice that would define everything. Everything his father had built, everything he believed in, hung in the balance of his next words and actions. "No." The word escaped Alexander's lips before rational thought could intervene with caution about career suicide and fiduciary responsibility to shareholders. Morrison's eyebrows rose in aristocratic surprise at unexpected resistance from someone who usually rubber-stamped their recommendations without question. Margaret Winters set down reading glasses with deliberate precision that suggested preparation for corporate warfare and hostile takeover. The room's silence felt dense enough to walk across, broken only by air conditioning's steady hum and tension. Alexander had just crossed a line that most executives knew better than to approach, let alone stride across. The word hung in the air like a declaration of war against everything they represented and believed. The silence that followed felt like the moment before an avalanche begins, when the first rock breaks free. "Excuse me?" Morrison's voice carried chill of old money encountering unexpected resistance from someone who should know their place. Laser pointer trembled in his hand, red dot dancing across wall screen like angry wasp seeking something to sting. Around the table, board members exchanged glances that spoke of boardroom coups and CEO replacements they'd orchestrated before. Alexander had just crossed a line that most executives knew better than to approach completely and utterly. The tension in the room felt electric, charged with the potential for corporate violence disguised as business necessity. They were predators who had just encountered unexpected resistance from what they thought was guaranteed prey ready for slaughter. The air itself seemed to crackle with hostile energy and barely contained fury at his defiance. Alexander stood slowly, chair rolling backward with barely a whisper against carpet thick enough to muffle gunshots and screams. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, the city spread below like circuit board of human ambition and suffering illuminated by morning sunshine. Somewhere in that urban landscape, Zoe Campbell was probably walking to work, unaware that her future hung in balance. "I said no." Alexander repeated, voice gaining strength with each syllable like a muscle being exercised after years of atrophy. We're not firing anyone, especially not the marketing interns who work harder than anyone in this building. His declaration felt like throwing down a gauntlet in a medieval court, challenging the established order to mortal combat. The words echoed in the boardroom like gunshots fired in a cathedral, shocking in their moral clarity and defiance. Morrison's face flushed the particular shade of red that came from decades of unchallenged authority meeting sudden, unexpected resistance. Alexander, you're being emotional about a business decision. These people are expendable resources. The word hung in recycled air like poison gas. Expendable, as if human beings came with expiration dates. Margaret Winters nodded agreement, her expression suggesting that emotions were luxury items executives couldn't afford in competitive markets. The room felt smaller with each passing second, walls closing in on moral choices that would define everyone present. The casual dehumanization in their language felt like listening to historical accounts of systematic oppression and genocide disguised as policy. Their ability to discuss human destruction with such clinical detachment felt like evidence of moral bankruptcy and spiritual death. Expendable? Alexander's voice carried 20 years of suppressed frustration with systems that reduced humans to statistical abstractions and profit margins. You call basic human decency emotional? He pulled his father's badge from jacket pocket, brass gleaming under conference room's lighting. The worn metal caught fluorescent glare, sending reflections across polished table like fragments of broken promises being restored. This belonged to my father. He built this company on the principle that people come first, not profit margins, not reports. People with names and families and dreams that matter more than your spreadsheets. The badge felt like a talisman against the evil that had infected his company, a reminder of what business used to mean. The brass seemed to glow with inner light that illuminated the moral darkness surrounding them. The badge landed on conference table with dull thunk that seemed to echo in sterile silence like gunshot in cathedral. Board members stared at tarnished brass as if it were live grenade with pin removed and timer counting down. Morrison's laser pointer drooped in his hand, red dot painting carpet like spilled blood from corporate murder scene. Through windows, October sunshine painted the city in deceptively warm colors that hid cold calculations driving human misery. Alexander felt something shift inside his chest, like tectonic plates realigning after years of pressure, building toward earthquake. The moment felt like a religious conversion, a sudden understanding of what he was supposed to do with his life. The badge seemed to pulse with energy, connecting him to his father's memory and the values he had abandoned. The boardroom suddenly felt like a battlefield where good and evil faced each other in open warfare. You're out of line, Hayes. Morrison's voice carried authority of money talking to peasants who should know their place in hierarchy. The board has fiduciary responsibility to shareholders. Your father's sentimental philosophies have no place in modern business environments. Other board members murmured agreement like congregation responding to familiar scripture about profit maximization and shareholder value above all else. They spoke of fiduciary duty as if it were divine commandment, shareholder value as if it were moral imperative. Conference room air felt thin, difficult to breathe without moral compromise and spiritual suffocation. The religious fervor with which they defended greed felt like witnessing a cult meeting dedicated to worship of money. Their faces showed the glazed certainty of true believers in a system that demanded human sacrifice for quarterly growth. Alexander walked to wall screen, where Zoe's name still glowed in accusatory red, like target painted on human dignity itself. With one finger, he traced letters of her surname. Campbell. Last night, this name belonged to shivering young woman clutching waterlogged notebook against chest. To these people, it was just data to be deleted for quarterly convenience and profit maximization. Zoe Campbell, he said aloud, voice filling room with authority that came from moral certainty. 24 years old, marketing analytics intern. Graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern with student loans that'll take decades to repay. She stays until midnight perfecting presentations that make us look brilliant to clients who never know her name. Her humanity reduced to a spreadsheet entry felt like the ultimate corruption of everything business should represent. The red highlighting around her name felt like blood splattered across her future by corporate indifference. Morrison clicked his pen with irritating rhythm like countdown timer toward execution hour approaching relentlessly and inevitably. Individual cases don't matter, Alexander. We're discussing operational efficiency metrics and cost-benefit analyses. Clinical language felt like acid on Alexander's tongue, corporate speak designed to distance decision-makers from human cost of convenience. Operational efficiency, human resources, personnel reductions. Through windows he could see people walking to work, unaware their livelihoods were being discussed like commodities. The disconnect between human reality and corporate abstraction felt obscene and morally bankrupt beyond any possibility of redemption. They had turned the destruction of lives into a science, complete with charts and graphs and presentations. The bureaucratization of evil felt like watching history repeat itself in suits and ties. She matters to me. Alexander's voice cut through Morrison's pen clicking with quiet finality that brooked no argument or negotiation from anyone present. He turned from screen to face board members. 11 faces arranged in expressions of professional concern, barely concealing hostility. These were people who could calculate exact cost of human suffering, who measured success in stock prices and quarterly growth. His father would have been ashamed of what Hayes Technologies had become under their guidance and his abdication. The room felt like a courtroom where he was both judge and defendant, prosecutor and jury in trial. The weight of moral judgment pressed down on him like physical force, demanding immediate action and decision. Silence stretched like piano wire pulled to breaking point, tight enough to snap under minimal additional pressure from any source. Margaret Winters cleared her throat delicately, sound somehow conveying 40 years of boardroom experience and emotional conditioning against weakness. "Alexander," she said in tone reserved for confused children who didn't understand adult realities completely. "Perhaps you need time to consider broader implications. Personal attachments to individual employees can cloud business judgment significantly." Her words carried weight of institutional wisdom and complete spiritual bankruptcy that prioritized abstractions over human faces. The patronizing tone felt like being lectured by war criminals about the necessity of their actions for greater good. Her smile felt like ice covering a frozen lake that concealed corpses beneath its surface. Alexander laughed, sound bubbling up from depths where he'd buried his conscience under years of corporate conditioning and compromise. The laughter seemed to surprise him as much as board members who shifted uncomfortably in leather chairs. Wall screen continued displaying Zoe's name in red, digital death sentence waiting for final approval from people who'd never experienced hardship. Irony wasn't lost. Same technology connecting them to customers was being used to disconnect from employee humanity. The laughter felt like a dam bursting, releasing years of suppressed recognition of the absurdity and evil. He was laughing at himself as much as them, at the person he had become under their influence. The sound echoed into the boardroom like breaking glass, shattering the pretense of civility that disguised their cruelty. "Personal attachment?" Alexander's laughter died as quickly as it began, replaced by moral clarity that felt like clean air after breathing smog. "You call basic human dignity a personal attachment?" He retrieved his father's badge from conference table, brass warm from lighting. Metal felt alive in his palm, weighted with decisions made when conscience remained intact and uncorrupted. Around table, 11 faces watched him with expression of doctors observing interesting pathology in clinical laboratory setting. The badge felt like Excalibur being pulled from the stone, a symbol of righteous power awakening after dormancy. The brass seemed to pulse with energy that connected him to something larger than quarterly profits and shareholder value. The weight of it felt like responsibility for 800 souls depending on his decisions. Morrison set down laser pointer with deliberate precision, device clicking against polished wood like judge's gavel announcing final verdict. Alexander, the board is prepared to make these decisions with or without your approval. Your emotional state is concerning. Threat hung in recycled air like smoke from corporate funeral pyre, barely disguised beneath professional politeness and civility. These people had played power games longer than Alexander had been alive, knew exactly how to apply pressure. They understood leverage like medieval torturers understood anatomy, and they were preparing to use every tool available. The threat felt like a gauntlet being thrown down, a challenge to see who truly controlled the company. Their faces showed the cold calculation of predators preparing to devour wounded prey that had dared to show weakness. Boardroom door burst open with enough force to rattle framed mission statement on adjacent wall, glass vibrating like struck tuning fork. Rebecca stood in doorway with tablet clutched against chest, face flushed with exertion and something resembling genuine panic. "Mr. Hayes," she said, voice cracking with stress that suggested emergency rather than routine interruption of meeting. "There's been an incident. You need to come immediately." Behind her, hallway buzzed with unusual activity, voices carrying undertones of crisis that penetrated sound-proofed walls. The interruption felt like divine intervention, a chance to escape the moral quicksand of the boardroom before complete consumption. The timing seemed too perfect to be coincidence, as if universe itself was providing escape route from moral compromise. Rebecca's urgency felt real, cutting through the artificial atmosphere of corporate calculation like sword through silk. Alexander moved toward door without hesitation, leaving board members frozen in leather chairs like mannequins in expensive department store display. Hallway clusters of employees spoke in hushed tones, faces painted with concern and speculation about whatever had disrupted routine. Elevator felt like time machine as it descended, each floor marking transition from corporate politics to human crisis. Rebecca stood beside him, tablet screen reflecting worried expression that suggested personal involvement rather than professional concern only. The descent felt like falling from hell back to earth, from the rarefied air of executive privilege to reality. Each floor that passed felt like shedding layers of corporate conditioning that had accumulated over years of compromise. The elevator's mechanical hum sounded like freedom bells ringing in the distance, calling him back to humanity. "It's Zoe Campbell," Rebecca explained as elevator numbers descended with mechanical precision toward ground floor reality and truth. Security called from lobby. She collapsed during morning rush hour. They're saying exhaustion, maybe dehydration, possibly something much worse. Elevator reached ground floor with soft chime that seemed inappropriately cheerful given the circumstances at hand. Through glass doors, Alexander could see small crowd gathered near information desk, morning routines disrupted by visible misfortune. The timing felt like cosmic justice, forcing him to confront the human cost of their boardroom decisions directly. The sight of concerned employees gathering around one of their own felt like a glimpse of the humanity that corporate culture tried to eliminate. The contrast between the sterile boardroom discussion and this real human crisis felt like slap across his face. Zoe sat in lobby chair that dwarfed her slight frame, paramedic kneeling beside her with blood pressure cuff wrapped around her arm. Her face was paper white except for dark circles under eyes that looked like bruises from exhaustion and chronic stress. Same notebook from last night lay open on her lap, pages warped from water damage but still filled with handwriting. She looked up as Alexander approached, embarrassment and gratitude warring in expression that broke his heart into pieces. The sight of her collapsed in their lobby felt like physical manifestation of corporate guilt, a living indictment of everything. The marble floors and expensive furnishings suddenly felt like decorations in a mausoleum dedicated to human sacrifice. Her vulnerability in this space designed to intimidate felt like accusation against every decision he had ever made. The company logo on the wall behind her seemed to leer down like golden idol demanding blood offerings. "I'm fine," Zoe said before anyone could ask, though voice carried thread quality of someone fighting to maintain composure. "Just didn't eat breakfast this morning. Low blood sugar, that's all." Lie came easily, practiced from months of explaining away symptoms. Paramedic frowned at his readings, clearly skeptical of self-diagnosis that ignored obvious signs of malnutrition and exhaustion. Around them, morning commuters slowed pace to stare, human curiosity temporarily overriding professional urgency to reach desks. The lie felt transparent, a desperate attempt to maintain dignity in a system designed to strip it away completely. Her refusal to admit weakness felt like learned behavior from environment that punished vulnerability and rewarded silence. The gathered employees' faces showed mixture of concern and recognition. They understood her struggle because many shared it. Alexander knelt beside Chair, bringing himself to Zoe's eye level in gesture that acknowledged her humanity rather than subordinate status. This close, he could see fine tremor in hands that never stopped working, way she kept swallowing. Her blazer was same one from last night, now clean and pressed, but carrying invisible weight of everything witnessed. "When's the last time you had a real meal?" he asked quietly, voice pitched below range of onlookers. The question felt like confession, an admission that he had failed in his most basic responsibility as employer. The luxury of the lobby suddenly felt obscene when contrasted with her obvious malnutrition and suffering. The marble columns that soared overhead seemed like monuments to indifference, impressive architecture built on foundation of human misery. The question hung in air like admission of guilt from entire corporate system that created her suffering. Zoe's eyes darted away, focusing on notebook where columns of numbers marched across. Page in neat rows that couldn't balance. Budget calculations, Alexander realized with growing horror and recognition of systematic failure. Rent, utilities, food, medical expenses, young woman's attempt to make impossible mathematics work through determination and creativity. Numbers didn't balance. Gaps bridged only by hope and mounting desperation that bled through every calculation. Her handwriting grew shakier toward bottom of page, exhaustion bleeding through even her meticulous record-keeping like blood through bandages. The notebook felt like archaeological evidence of systematic failure, documentation of how their compensation structure created poverty among workforce. Each number told story of choice between survival and dignity, medicine and food, shelter and hope. "I eat plenty," Zoe said, but stomach chose that moment to rumble audibly, betraying lie with biological honesty that couldn't be suppressed. Paramedic exchanged meaningful look with partner, both professionals who'd seen enough crisis to recognize signs of prolonged neglect. They spoke in medical shorthand about vitals and transport options, clinical efficiency providing stark contrast to human drama. The irony was devastating. She was starving while working for a company that spent millions on executive bonuses. The contrast between their marble lobby and her empty stomach felt like perfect metaphor for everything wrong. The sound of her stomach rumbling felt like thunderclap in the expensive silence, announcing truth that corporate language tried to hide. Even her body was rebelling against the lie of corporate care and concern for employee welfare. Alexander made decision that felt like stepping off cliff into unknown territory where normal rules of corporate behavior didn't apply. "Rebecca," he said without taking eyes off Zoe's face. "Call Dr. Martinez. Tell him I'm bringing someone in for examination." Zoe's eyes widened in alarm, protest forming on lips that barely had strength for speech or resistance. Around them, lobby's marble surfaces reflected their conversation back in fragmented echoes, making privacy impossible in fishbowl architecture. The decision felt like the first genuinely moral choice he had made in years. A small step. The public nature of his compassion felt important, a declaration that the company's values were changing, starting immediately. Every eye in the lobby was on them, witnessing moment when power chose compassion over profit. The marble walls seemed to echo with whispers of change beginning to spread through the building. "Mr. Hayes, I can't accept," Zoe began, but Alexander held up hand that somehow managed to be both gentle and authoritative. Motion was probably developed in boardrooms where halting discussion could mean difference between success and failure completely. The gesture carried weight of executive authority being used for protection rather than profit maximization for once. He could feel the watching eyes of employees and visitors, all witnessing this moment of unexpected humanity. The public nature of his decision felt like declaration of war against the system that had created this situation. The gesture seemed to silence the entire lobby, creating pocket of sacred space around their conversation. His hand in the air felt like blessing being offered to someone who had been cursed by systematic indifference. "You can, and you will," Alexander said, voice carrying quiet authority that had built technology empire from his father's manufacturing business. "This isn't a request that requires your consent or permission." He stood, motioning for Rebecca to make call that would probably cost more than Zoe's salary. Paramedics packed equipment with efficient movements, satisfied that Zoe wasn't in immediate medical danger, but concerned about implications. Their departure left vacuum of silence that filled quickly with lobby acoustics and morning traffic filtering through glass. The moment felt like turning point, not just for Zoe, but for entire company culture that had allowed situation to develop. The paramedic's professional concern seemed to validate his instinct that something was fundamentally wrong with how they treated people. The medical emergency felt like symptom of much larger disease infecting their corporate culture. Zoe struggled to feet, notebook clutched against chest like armor that might protect her from unwanted kindness and attention. "I have meetings this morning. Morrison account presentation is at 10, and I still need to finalize demographics data." Voice carried particular desperation of someone whose identity was entirely wrapped up in professional performance and fear. Even collapsing from exhaustion, first concern was work deadlines and client obligations that mattered more than health. The dedication should have been admirable, but instead felt heartbreaking in its misdirection and tragedy. She was literally dying to serve company that was planning to fire her without ceremony or explanation. Her commitment to work, even in crisis, felt like indictment of system that demanded such sacrifice from its most vulnerable employees. "Morrison account can wait," Alexander said, though irony wasn't lost that they were discussing same Morrison who sat upstairs calculating cost. Corporate synchronicity at its most brutal. Man who wanted to fire her was also client she was desperate to impress. "Rebecca, reschedule everything on Ms. Campbell's calendar for today. Mark it as executive priority requiring immediate attention and action." Magic words that would move mountains and silence questions from people who understood corporate hierarchy and power. The power of his position felt intoxicating when used for good instead of profit maximization and shareholder satisfaction. For once, executive privilege would serve justice instead of greed and systematic exploitation of vulnerable people. The words felt like incantation casting spell of protection around Zoe, shielding her from corporate machinery that consumed lives. De Martinez's office occupied top floor of medical building that catered to executives and celebrities, people for whom privacy was worth prices. Waiting room looked more like luxury hotel lobby than doctor's office, all leather furniture and abstract art chosen to suggest wealth. Zoe perched on edge of chair that probably cost more than her monthly rent, still clutching notebook like anchor. The contrast between the opulent waiting room and her obvious financial distress felt sharp enough to cut glass. Every detail of luxury around them served as a reminder of inequality that had created her situation and suffering. The magazine selection alone probably cost more than she spent on food in typical month of careful budgeting. The waiting room felt like a museum of excess, displaying wealth while she struggled to afford basic necessities for survival. "Why are you doing this?" Zoe asked as they waited for her name to be called by a receptionist who treated appointments like services. Question carried layers of meaning. Why hotel room? Why doctor's visit? Why any kindness at all in world that taught indifference? Her fingers traced edge of notebook, following water stains from last night's rain like roadmap of recent disaster. Waiting room's silence felt heavy with unspoken truths and uncomfortable recognitions of systematic failure and inequality. The question hung between them like bridge across class divide that usually remained invisible in corporate settings. She couldn't understand kindness from power because her experience had taught her to expect only exploitation and neglect. The luxury surrounding them seemed to mock her question, displaying wealth while she questioned basic human decency. Alexander considered question, weighing honesty against comfortable lies that executive training had taught him to deploy when situations became complicated. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, cities spread below like three-dimensional graph of human ambition and suffering measured in real time. Somewhere in those buildings, board members were probably calculating cost of his current absence from elimination meeting. "Because someone should," he said finally, simplicity of answer surprising him with its moral clarity and truth. The words felt like confession and declaration simultaneously, an admission of failure and commitment to change everything. It was the most honest thing he had said in years of corporate doublespeak and moral compromise. The simplicity of the answer seemed to cut through years of accumulated cynicism and calculation that had defined his career. 6 months later, Hayes Technologies reported its most profitable quarter in company history, employee productivity having increased 37%, while turnover dropped to 0. The Emergency Assistance Fund had helped 43 families navigate medical crises and housing emergencies that would have destroyed their stability. Zoe Campbell became marketing director. Her mother completed cancer treatment successfully, and Alexander's father's badge sat polished on his desk daily. The transformation proved that treating people well wasn't just morally right, but profitable, revolutionary concept that business schools began studying worldwide. The badge reflected light that reminded him that some promises were worth keeping regardless of quarterly consequences and shareholder demands.